Sunday morning shattered when Officer Martinez cornered retired teacher Eleanor Washington outside her neighborhood church. What started as racial profiling escalated to physical assault. But he had no idea her husband was watching. The final hymn had ended, leaving behind the sacred stillness that only Sunday mornings could bring. Eleanor Washington, 62, descended the weathered steps of St. Paul's Community Church, her quiet grace radiating the kind of dignity that comes from decades of facing the world with unwavering strength. She held a small bouquet of pink carnations close to her chest, a weekly tradition, flowers for her late mother's grave, and her worn leather purse containing the scripture verses she'd copied during service. Her walk through the Oak Avenue residential district was more than routine, it was meditation. Each step on the familiar sidewalk connected her to 40 years of the same Sunday ritual. The maple trees cast dancing shadows across her path, and the scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the lingering fragrance of her carnations. This was her sanctuary time, the bridge between worship and the week ahead. But today, something felt different. Eleanor sensed it before she saw it, that particular weight of unwelcome attention. A patrol car sat idling across the street, engine running, and through the windshield, she could see him watching. Officer Martinez, according to the nameplate visible even from this distance, was a stocky man in his late 30s with the kind of stare that wasn't observing but hunting. Eleanor had spent 6 decades learning to read these moments. Her grandmother had taught her, her mother had reinforced it, and life had provided endless practice. She recognized the stillness of a predator sizing up prey, the way his eyes tracked her movement with assumption rather than assessment. Her spine straightened imperceptibly, her pace remaining steady. Not today, she told herself, the same prayer she'd whispered countless times before. The patrol car door opened with a metallic groan that seemed to echo louder than it should. Heavy boots hit the pavement with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to announce authority. Eleanor didn't quicken her pace or turn around, doing so would signal the fear he expected, the submission he craved. Instead, she continued forward, her cardigan catching the morning breeze, the carnations steady in her grip. "Ma'am." His voice carried across the quiet street like a command disguised as courtesy. Eleanor stopped and turned with the measured grace of someone who understood that every movement was being evaluated. "Yes, officer." He approached with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, but his eyes held something harder than professional duty. They swept over her from the pink carnations to her church bulletin, from her sensible shoes to the small gold cross necklace at her throat. "Where you heading this morning?" The question carried an undertone that suggested she needed permission to exist in this space. "Home," Eleanor replied simply. 3 blocks north on Elm Street." "You live around here?" His tone made it clear he doubted she belonged in this well-maintained neighborhood with its manicured lawns and 2-story colonials. Eleanor's response came without hesitation, steady and matter-of-fact. "I've lived on Elm Street longer than you've been wearing that uniform, officer." Something flickered across Martinez's face, surprise, then irritation. He'd expected deference, the automatic submission that his badge usually commanded. Instead, he'd encountered quiet authority that refused to be diminished. The morning air seemed to thicken between them as 2 very different kinds of power faced each other on the empty sidewalk. He stepped closer, using his physical presence as punctuation to his authority. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but underneath lay steel forged by decades of teaching teenagers who thought they could intimidate her. "Have I violated any laws, officer?" "We received a report," Martinez said, the lie forming as he spoke, "of a woman matching your description acting suspiciously in this neighborhood. I've just come from Sunday's service at St. Paul's. I'm walking home with flowers for my mother's grave." Eleanor's words were precise, each one a small act of resistance against the narrative he was trying to construct. "I still need verification," he insisted, his jaw tightening as he realized she wasn't going to make this easy. "And do you stop every churchgoer carrying flowers to verify their right to walk home?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the neighborhood was waking up. A jogger slowed her pace, sensing tension. An elderly man watering his garden paused, his attention drawn by the scene unfolding on his peaceful street. Martinez noticed the growing audience, and instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. "Ma'am, I need you to produce identification immediately." Eleanor looked at him with the same patient expression she'd used on countless students who thought volume could substitute for logic. "Officer Martinez," she said, reading his nameplate, "I know my constitutional rights. Unless you have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, you have no legal authority to detain me." The use of his name caught him off guard. Suddenly, he wasn't just officer, he was accountable, identifiable, human. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows between Eleanor and Officer Martinez as their standoff intensified. What had begun as a routine Sunday walk had transformed into something much more significant, a collision between assumption and dignity that would reshape both their lives. Martinez felt his authority slipping with each measured word Eleanor spoke. In his 8 years on the force, he'd grown accustomed to immediate compliance, especially from people who looked like her in neighborhoods like this. His training had taught him to establish dominance quickly, to control the narrative before questions could arise. But Eleanor Washington was rewriting his script in real time. "You're refusing a lawful order," he stated, his voice rising slightly as passers-by began to notice the confrontation. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her pace, pulling out her phone. A teenager on his bike stopped at the corner, instinctively understanding that something was wrong. "I'm declining to participate in harassment," Eleanor corrected, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had commanded classrooms full of skeptical adolescents for 4 decades. "There's a significant legal difference." Her correction stung because it was accurate. Martinez had no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, nothing but his own biases and the assumption that a black woman in this neighborhood must be out of place. The realization that she understood the law better than he'd hoped made him desperate to reassert control. "Look, lady," he said, abandoning any pretense of professionalism, "you can do this the easy way or the hard way." Eleanor shifted the carnations to her left hand and looked at him with something approaching pity. "Officer Martinez, I've been teaching high school mathematics for 40 years. I've faced down teenagers who thought they were tougher than calculus. Do you really believe intimidation tactics are going to work on me?" The revelation that she was an educator, someone society was supposed to respect, should have given him pause. Instead, it intensified his need to prove his authority. In his worldview, respect was something that had to be earned through submission, not commanded through competence. "I don't care what you do for work," he snapped. "Right now, you're acting suspicious, and I have every right to investigate." "Suspicious how?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying the patience of someone genuinely interested in his reasoning. "By walking home from church? By carrying flowers? By knowing my constitutional rights?" Each question was a small blade, cutting through the tissue-thin justification for his actions. Around them, the audience was growing. Mrs. Chen from the corner house had come out to collect her newspaper and remained on her porch, watching. 2 joggers had stopped their run and were conferring in low voices. A man walking his golden retriever had paused across the street, his phone already recording. Martinez felt the walls closing in. Every moment of extended confrontation made his position weaker, his lack of justification more obvious. But backing down now would be admitting error, acknowledging that his initial approach had been wrong. His pride wouldn't allow that retreat. "You're creating a disturbance," he said, grasping for any charge that might stick. Eleanor looked around at the quiet residential street, at the people who had stopped to watch not because she was causing trouble, but because they recognized injustice unfolding before their eyes. "Officer, the only disturbance here is your decision to harass a law-abiding citizen." Her words carried across the morning air with crystal clarity. Several people nodded in agreement. Mrs. Chen called out from her porch, "Leave that woman alone. She hasn't done anything." The community support should have been his cue to retreat, to find a graceful exit from his mistake. Instead, Martinez felt cornered, exposed, humiliated. His face flushed as he realized that everyone watching understood exactly what was happening, that his authority was being questioned not by a criminal, but by a respectable member of the community he was supposed to serve. "Everyone needs to mind their own business," he shouted, his composure cracking completely. "This is our business," called out the man with the golden retriever. "This is our neighborhood, and she belongs here more than you do." Eleanor remained calm in the center of the storm, holding her carnations like a shield of innocence. "Officer Martinez," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the growing murmur of support, "you have a choice right now. You can walk away, and we can both continue our Sunday morning in peace. Or you can escalate this situation and face the consequences of whatever happens next." It was a reasonable offer, a dignified exit ramp from a confrontation that was spiraling beyond his control. But Martinez heard it as a threat, a challenge to the absolute authority he believed his badge provided. The idea that this woman, this black woman in this nice neighborhood, thought she could dictate terms to him was intolerable. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "I'm offering you wisdom," Eleanor replied. "The same wisdom I've offered students who thought they were smarter than consequences." Her comparison of him to a misbehaving teenager was the final straw. In Martinez's mind, respect was binary, you had it or you didn't, and it was measured by fear, not earned through character. This woman's calm defiance, her community support, her obvious intelligence, all combined to create a perfect storm of wounded ego and misplaced authority. "That's it," he snarled, moving toward her with sudden, violent intent. "You're under arrest." "For what crime?" Eleanor asked, standing her ground as he approached. But Martinez was beyond reason now, beyond law, operating purely on the primitive need to reassert dominance through force. The moment arrived with sickening inevitability. Officer Martinez lunged forward, his professional restraint completely abandoned. His thick hand seized Eleanor's shoulders with brutal force, spinning her around and slamming her back against the brick wall of Sunrise Cafe. The impact sent shockwaves through her 62-year-old frame, her breath escaping in a sharp gasp as rough bricks scraped against her cardigan and the skin beneath. The pink carnations exploded from her grip, petals scattering across the sidewalk like drops of blood. Her leather purse hit the pavement, spilling its contents, reading glasses, scripture verses, peppermints, and photographs of grandchildren, across the concrete in a tragic display of interrupted dignity. Martinez pressed his forearm across Eleanor's throat, not quite choking her but applying enough pressure to assert total domination. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot with rage and adrenaline. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he hissed through clenched teeth. Eleanor's hands came up instinctively, not to strike but to brace herself against the wall behind her. Her brown eyes, magnified by pain but undimmed by fear, locked onto his with steady defiance. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, her voice strained but unbroken. "The only mistake," Martinez growled, pressing harder, "was your attitude." Around them, the morning erupted into chaos. Mrs. Chen screamed from her porch, "Get off her! Someone call 911. The teenager on the bike was already dialing, his young voice cracking as he spoke to emergency dispatch. The joggers rushed closer, their phones out, live streaming the assault to social media platforms that would carry this moment around the world within minutes. "Police brutality on Oak Avenue," one of them shouted into her phone. "Officer attacking elderly black woman." The golden retriever began barking frantically, sensing his owner's distress. More neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. An elderly white man in his bathrobe called out, "I know this woman. She's a teacher. Leave her alone." But Martinez was locked in his own world of violence and justification. Eleanor's calm resistance had triggered something primal in him, a need to break her spirit that transcended any professional duty. He adjusted his grip, pressing his arm more firmly against her windpipe. Eleanor felt the oxygen restriction, felt the wall's rough texture through her torn cardigan, felt the weight of his authority bearing down on her literal and figurative throat. But she also felt something else, the presence of witnesses, the power of truth being documented, the strength that comes from knowing you're on the right side of history. "I can't breathe properly," she managed to say, her words carrying clearly to the growing crowd and their recording devices. "Should have thought of that before," Martinez replied, his voice now audible to everyone present. A woman's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "I'm a nurse. You're cutting off her airway." She pushed forward through the crowd, her medical training overriding any fear of confronting a police officer. "She could have a heart condition. You could kill her." The word "kill" seemed to penetrate Martinez's rage-induced tunnel vision. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the dozens of phones pointed at him, the growing crowd, the multiple voices calling for his badge number and demanding his supervisor. But instead of releasing Eleanor, he doubled down. "Everyone back away," he shouted. "This is police business. This is assault," someone yelled back. "We're not moving." Eleanor used the moment of his distraction to speak, her voice carrying despite the pressure on her throat. "You all see this," she said to the crowd. "You see what happens when walking home from church becomes a crime." Her words were immediately repeated and amplified by the witnesses. She was just walking home from church. He attacked her for no reason. This is what systemic racism looks like. The narrative was being written in real time, and Martinez was losing control of it completely. Every second he maintained his position against Eleanor made him look worse, but releasing her now would be admitting the assault was unjustified. He was trapped by his own actions and pride. Eleanor, despite her pain and the difficulty breathing, recognized his dilemma. "Officer Martinez," she said quietly, her voice somehow reaching him through the chaos, "every second you keep me here makes this worse for you. I'm a retired mathematics teacher. I volunteer at 3 churches. I've never been arrested in my life. What do you think this looks like?" Her question forced him to see the scene through others' eyes, a uniformed officer restraining an elderly black woman against a wall while she held flowers and a church bulletin. No drugs, no weapons, no crime, just an intersection of prejudice and power that had spiraled completely out of control. "Shut up," he hissed, but his voice lacked conviction now. "The whole world is watching," Eleanor continued, her eyes indicating the forest of phones surrounding them. "Your family will see this. Your children. Your neighbors. Is this who you want them to see?" The live streams were indeed going viral. Comments were flooding in from viewers around the globe, expressing outrage at the scene unfolding in real time. #Oak Avenue assault was already trending, and Eleanor's dignity in the face of brutality was inspiring thousands of shares and calls for justice. Martinez's grip began to loosen slightly as the magnitude of his situation became clear. But just as he started to step back, just as it seemed the confrontation might end without further escalation, the screech of tires announced the arrival of someone who would change everything. A deep blue sedan had pulled to an abrupt stop in the middle of Oak Avenue, its driver's door flying open before the engine had fully silenced. From it emerged a figure whose presence immediately shifted the entire dynamic of the scene, a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose commanding authority was evident in every line of his posture. The crowd fell silent as he surveyed the scene, his wife pinned against a brick wall by a police officer, surrounded by dozens of witnesses with phones raised. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Take your hands off my wife." The voice that cut through the morning chaos belonged to Marcus Washington, and it carried the kind of authority that comes not from a badge or uniform, but from decades of commanding courtrooms as a federal prosecutor. At 58, he possessed the physical presence of a man who had played college football and the intellectual gravitas of someone who had spent 30 years making criminals pay for their crimes. Officer Martinez's head snapped toward the voice, his grip on Eleanor instinctively loosening. What he saw made his blood run cold, an imposing black man in a tailored navy suit approaching with measured, dangerous calm. Everything about Marcus Washington's bearing suggested power, real power, not the artificial authority of a badge, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly how the system works and having the connections to make it respond. Marcus had been driving home from an emergency meeting at the federal courthouse when he'd received Mrs. Chen's frantic call. "Your wife is being attacked by a police officer on Oak Avenue." The words had sent ice through his veins and fire through his heart. He'd made the 12-minute drive in 7, his mind already cataloging federal civil rights statutes and constitutional violations. Now, seeing Eleanor pressed against the brick wall, her cardigan torn, carnation petals scattered at her feet like evidence of destroyed innocence, Marcus felt a fury so pure it was almost transcendent. But this was not the time for emotion, this was the time for the calculated precision that had made him one of the most feared prosecutors in the federal system. "I said," Marcus repeated, his voice dropping to a register that made several witnesses step back involuntarily, "take your hands off my wife." Martinez released Eleanor completely, stumbling backward as if he'd been struck. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear moments before, uniformed authority versus civilian submission, had been utterly shattered. The crowd sensed the shift immediately, phones swiveling to capture this new player whose very presence seemed to change the rules of engagement. Eleanor straightened slowly, one hand rubbing her throat where Martinez's arm had pressed. Marcus moved to her side with fluid grace, his eyes never leaving the officer who had dared to put hands on the woman he'd loved for 35 years. "Are you injured?" Marcus asked Eleanor, his voice dropping to intimate concern while maintaining edge that suggested violence if the answer was yes. "I'm all right," Eleanor replied, though her voice was hoarse. "But he needs to understand what he's done." Marcus nodded, then turned his full attention to Martinez, who stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. "Officer," Marcus said, his prosecutor's voice carrying clearly to every witness and every phone recording the scene, "I need your name, badge number, and supervisor's contact information. Right now." There's been a misunderstanding," Martinez stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "No," Marcus cut him off with surgical precision. "There has been no misunderstanding. What I witnessed was a clear case of assault under color of authority, deprivation of civil rights under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242, and possible hate crime enhancement under the Matthew Shepard Act. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The crowd murmured as Marcus's legal expertise became apparent. Someone whispered, "Is he a lawyer?" Another voice responded, "He's the federal prosecutor, Marcus Washington. He's the one who put away those corrupt city officials last year." Recognition rippled through the witnesses like electricity. This wasn't just any concerned husband, this was the man whose prosecution of police misconduct cases had been featured on the front page of the local newspaper. Martinez's face went pale as the magnitude of his catastrophic error became clear. "You assaulted the wrong woman, Officer Martinez," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "You assaulted a retired educator with 40 years of service to this community. You assaulted a church volunteer who has mentored hundreds of at-risk youth. You assaulted the wife of a federal prosecutor who specializes in civil rights violations. And you did it in front of dozens of witnesses with recording devices." Marcus gestured toward the crowd, where phones continued capturing every word. "This footage is already viral. #Oak Avenue assault is trending nationally. Your face, your badge number, your department, they're all going to be household names by tonight. And not in a good way." At that moment, a police supervisor arrived, Captain Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran whose reputation for fairness had earned respect throughout the community. He surveyed the scene with experienced eyes, the scattered carnations, the torn cardigan, the crowd of agitated witnesses, and Officer Martinez looking like he wanted to disappear. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this was bad. Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm Marcus Washington, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District. This officer assaulted my wife without provocation while she was walking home from church." Rodriguez's expression tightened as he recognized Marcus's name and reputation. "Mr. Washington, can you walk me through what happened?" "Better than that," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the witnesses. "We have multiple live streams of the entire incident. Your officer stopped my wife, a 62-year-old retired teacher, demanded identification without reasonable suspicion, and when she correctly cited her constitutional rights, he physically assaulted her. Eleanor spoke for the first time since Marcus's arrival, her voice still hoarse but carrying moral authority. Captain, I've lived in this neighborhood for 25 years. I've never had so much as a parking ticket. I was walking home from St. Paul's Community Church with flowers for my mother's grave when your officer decided I didn't belong here. Rodriguez looked at Martinez with disappointment and growing anger. Is this accurate, Officer Martinez? Martinez opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain his actions? How could he justify assaulting an elderly woman whose only crime was failing to show proper deference to his assumed authority? The silence is answer enough, Marcus observed. Captain, I'm formally notifying you that we'll be filing federal civil rights charges, pursuing departmental sanctions, and seeking a full investigation into Officer Martinez's history of complaints. This isn't his first incident, I guarantee it. The crowd began to cheer and applaud, sensing that justice was finally asserting itself. Marcus raised his hand for quiet. This doesn't end here, he announced to the gathered witnesses and the phones still recording. This is where we draw the line. No more walking away. No more quiet settlements. No more protecting officers who think the badge gives them the right to brutalize citizens. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Officer Martinez, you're suspended pending investigation. Badge and weapon, now. As Martinez handed over his badge with shaking hands, Eleanor picked up her scattered belongings with dignity intact. The carnations were ruined, but her spirit was unbroken. Thank you all for witnessing, she told the crowd. Thank you for not walking away. The applause that followed carried more than appreciation, it carried the promise of change. Within hours, the Oak Avenue incident had exploded across social media platforms, transforming from a local confrontation into a national conversation about police accountability and racial justice. The hashtag Eleanor Washington joined hashtag Oak Avenue assault as millions shared the footage of a dignified educator maintaining her composure while being assaulted by Officer Martinez. Marcus Washington moved with the precision of a surgeon, filing federal civil rights charges, demanding a Department of Justice investigation, and coordinating with civil rights organizations to ensure the incident wouldn't be buried in bureaucratic delays. His 30 years of prosecutorial experience had taught him that justice delayed was often justice denied. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed. The combination of crystal-clear video evidence, multiple witnesses, and Marcus's relentless pressure created a perfect storm of accountability. Within a week, Martinez was facing federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, assault, and civil rights violations. But the impact extended far beyond one officer's fate. Eleanor's calm dignity in the face of brutality had inspired something deeper than outrage, it had inspired action. Churches throughout the city began organizing Know Your Rights seminars. The footage was being used in police training programs as an example of how not to interact with citizens. The trial, when it came, was swift and decisive. The courtroom was packed as Eleanor took the witness stand, her voice clear and strong as she described the assault. I wasn't attacked because of anything I did, she testified. I was attacked because of what Officer Martinez assumed when he looked at me. That assumption nearly cost me my dignity, my safety, and potentially my life. Martinez's conviction on all charges was met with applause from the gallery. But Eleanor's statement outside the courthouse carried even more weight. This verdict isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what we refuse to let happen to others. It's about saying that every person, regardless of age, race, or background, has the right to walk home from church in peace. The ripple effects continued to spread. Marcus led a comprehensive review of the police department's use of force policies, while Eleanor founded the Community Dignity Project, an organization dedicated to training citizens on their rights and supporting victims of police misconduct. At the first community town hall, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium and asked the question that would define her legacy: what kind of community do we want to be? One where walking home from church can turn into a fight for your life. Or one where dignity and justice aren't privileges to be earned, but rights to be protected? The answer came in the form of real change. New oversight mechanisms, mandatory bias training, and community policing initiatives that made officers accountable to the neighborhoods they served. The Oak Avenue incident had become a catalyst for transformation. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the same spot where Martinez had assaulted her. The brick wall had been painted with a mural depicting hands of different colors joined together, with the words, dignity, justice, community, written below. The carnations she now carried were for the mural's dedication, a symbol of beauty rising from violence. Marcus joined her, as he had every Sunday since the incident, ensuring she never walked alone. "Any regrets?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, touching the spot where Martinez had pressed his arm against her throat. "Only that it took 62 years for me to realize that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be afraid." The story of Eleanor Washington's courage had traveled far beyond Oak Avenue, inspiring similar movements in cities across the country. Her quiet dignity had proven more powerful than any badge, her calm resistance more effective than any weapon. As they walked home together, Eleanor reflected on how a Sunday morning assault had transformed into a national awakening. Sometimes, she knew, justice came not from the courtroom but from ordinary people deciding they'd had enough. "What do you think would have happened if no one had been watching?" Marcus asked. Eleanor considered the question, then smiled. Someone was always watching. The question was whether they'd choose to see. Their story continues to inspire change, one Sunday morning at a time. What moments of injustice have you witnessed? How did you choose to respond? Share your experiences in the comments below. Remember, we're building a community based on respect and truth. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage overcoming injustice.